Hello everyone, my name is Assad and I, along with my group members Robert, Chloe, Christopher, and Sabrine have created this PowerPoint presentation to thoroughly discuss voter suppression in the United States. Voter suppression in US history and politics is any legal or extra-legal measure or strategy whose purpose or practical effect is to reduce voting or registering to vote. The goal of this act is basically to target members of a racial group, political party, or religious community. The overwhelming majority of victims of voter suppression in the US have unfortunately been African Americans. Before we take a deeper look at the obstacles American voters face, modern day voter suppression examples, and finally how to prevent voter suppression, let's first see who exactly is voting in the US. Based on research by the Brennan Center, 70.9% of white voters cast ballots, compared with only 58.4% of non-white voters in 2022. This is a disparity that will worsen with new restrictive voting laws. Now let's take a look at specific obstacles that voters face in the United States. More particularly, people of a different race, either African Americans or minorities, are more likely than whites to be disenfranchised due to having a felony record. African American voters have a harder time trying to register to vote at all. They also have a more difficult time staying on voter rolls and having their mail-in ballots counted. Moving on, the shortage of poll workers in predominantly African American neighborhoods causes voting poll closures. African Americans and voters of colors are less likely than whites to hold their required ID to vote, and therefore they're more burdened by voter ID laws. In addition, voters of color face longer wait times to vote than white ones, discouraging staying in line to vote. Typically, polling place consolidation is also an especially harmful activity for the turnout of racial and ethnic minorities, as it limits where you can go to vote. So if you, as an African American or minority, were initially planning to go vote at a location near your home, that closure of that polling station will eventually lead you to potentially have to go somewhere farther, and depending on your circumstance and situation, it may be difficult for you to go to that polling location. So these are common obstacles that people of color and minorities and African Americans face in the United States when voting. Unfortunately, voter suppression still takes part in the United States. Politicians often use unfounded claims of voter fraud to try to justify registration restrictions. For example, in 2011, Kansas Secretary of State Chris Kobach championed a law requiring Kansans to show proof of citizenship documents in order to register to vote. He cited false claims of non-citizen voting, which really wasn't the case at all. Most people typically don't carry the required documents on hand, like a passport or a birth certificate, and as a result, these types of laws end up blocking the registrations. And in this specific situation, 30,000 Kansans were unable to vote because of this law. In 2013, the Supreme Court overruled a specific section of the Voting Rights Act, which determines which jurisdictions are subject to the pre-clearance requirement of Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This section helps create a way to stop states notorious for discriminating voting laws by having any changes to the laws be reviewed first. So basically, without this section, states are allowed to create laws that discriminate and suppress voting without any federal oversight. Another example is in Tennessee, when after a surge in registrations during the 2018 midterm election, legislators there imposed substantial requirements on groups that foster political participation via voter registration efforts and created criminal and civil penalties against those who failed to comply with these onerous requirements and in turn turn in incomplete applications. In 2021, Georgia lawmakers made it a crime to provide food and water to voters standing in line at the polls, and these lines are notoriously long in Georgia, especially for communities of color. The last example is in Texas, where people such as Crystal Mason and Hervis Rogers were arrested and given outrageous sentences for what amounted at most to innocent mistakes made during the voting process. So as you can see here, that voter suppression is still very active in the United States, And these are some of the examples that are highlighted and brought to the forefront by media. As harsh voter suppression laws make it harder for people of color to vote, it's important that we take steps to stop this menace. The following can be done to help encourage people of color to vote. The first is to eliminate strict voter ID laws. These requirements typically serve to unfairly target low-income people, people of color, and the elderly by making it more burdensome to vote. The next is to prevent unnecessary poll closures. Lawmakers throughout the South have shuttered polling places located in predominantly black communities, creating long lines and preventing voters from accessing information about how and where to vote. The third aspect is to prohibit harmful voter purges. This is known as purging. It's basically a voter suppression tactic that is typically employed due to over-reliance on inaccurate data and largely unsubstantiated suspicion that a resident recently voted in another state or did not participate in recent elections. For example, Ohio sends address confirmation notices to citizens who vote irregularly, but if they neither reply nor vote in subsequent elections, their registration is simply canceled. A Reuters study found that this practice hits African American and low-income voters the hardest, resulting in tens of thousands of cancellations. The next aspect is to prioritize African American voters in political outreach. Politicians and political organizations have to do more to thoughtfully and consistently engage with African American voters. Although research has shown that direct contact is a promising method through which to increase political participation, according to one 2016 post-election survey, less than half of Black citizens had received any election-related contact from partisan or nonpartisan organizations. The next step is to recruit African American candidates for political office. For about 150 years, African American politicians have fought back against racism and advocated for solutions to solve the unique problems their communities face. Yet, African Americans are still grossly underrepresented in elected office. Despite making more than 13% of the total US population, today the country has only 3 African American US senators and not a single African American governor. The last aspect is to contact organizations like the ACLU to educate yourself and understand your voting laws and rights, and to fight back against people who make voter suppression happen. It's important to take all these aspects into consideration when looking at opportunities to prevent voter suppression in the United States. In order to change the future of voting in the United States, there are a couple of aspects that we can take a look at. To start with, education is a key component in progressing voting rights. Having voting education in early curriculum and throughout the education system would allow newer generations of voters to be knowledgeable of voting laws and learn what obstacles they may potentially face and how to counter them. In order to create this education program, similar to how driver's ed is implemented in and outside of schools, we could create a pre-registration program so that students can participate in it. This will also allow all students to be automatically registered to vote on their 18th birthday and correctly with state laws and according to state laws. This can be done in schools or outside buildings, just like driver's ed, since being registered to vote should be just as easy as getting a driver's license. We could also create additional funding for schools that follow this program because it would incentivize more education systems to follow suit. These incentives would help schools greatly in minorities areas, especially because they lack funding typically, and it would help for better education for its residents. Another aspect is peer pressure. It's a powerful tool to get younger people to join the bandwagon of what other younger people are doing. So with this education and pre-registration program, more of the 18 to 24 demographic would be voting. When younger people see their peers voting, they're more likely to vote too. In the end, this education and pre-registration program would create new generations of educated voters that can help defeat the current voter suppressing government and laws in place, progressing us as a country towards a more inclusive future. Thank you so much for listening to this presentation, and please don't forget to vote.